Our next project is one of the more advanced ones, but not necessarily because it's more difficult, just because it'll take a couple of days. We did this over the course of 3. I'm gonna show you how to create a wall with visual interest. In this chapter, we're gonna learn how to do a faux plaster wall. So this idea actually came from the fact that I work on old houses a lot and they often have really bad texture. One, it had such bad texture that it was actually a safety hazard. And then in other rooms, there'll be 2 or 3 different kind of textures where there's bad patch jobs. So I thought this idea of kind of doing a faux plaster wall, think like old European homes, really create a wall with visual interest. For this project, what you're gonna need is joint compound, which is also known as mud, and this will be what goes on the wall. Some paint, and that's gonna give the mud a little bit of color. A drill with a mixer, which will mix everything up. A mud knife and a squeegee, and that's how you'll apply it on the wall. Sandpaper to knock down any big bumps. Some water to thin out the mud. Stir sticks and a mud pan to hold the joint compound. This project's gonna take a couple of days to put on multiple coats, but one thing I love about this project is you can't really make mistakes. The more messy it is and the more irregularities, it looks more like a plaster wall, so you can have fun with it. I'm gonna mix up the first coat today, and then we're gonna let that dry overnight, and then we'll do the second coat tomorrow. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so we are going to mix up the plaster that we're gonna put on the wall. We're gonna put about half of this into the bucket, and then we're gonna add some paint to it to give it a base color. This process is kind of similar to skim coating, but with skim coating, what you wanna do is cover up the texture completely, make the wall flat, and then paint over it. In this one, we're actually gonna add the paint to the joint compound and then put it on with a lot of movement, and that way it's gonna create this effect that looks like a plaster wall. So now that the bucket is about halfway full with the mud, I'm gonna add some water. And I would start with about a cup. You're going for a yogurt-like consistency. And after you put your water in, then we're gonna add some paint. And one thing I wanna remind you of when you're putting the paint in is that the mud does have some color to it, so it will dry lighter than the color you mix up. This is where you can kind of experiment. We'll be doing 2 coats, so if you need to adjust it for the second coat and make it a little bit darker, you can always do that. Okay, that looks good. So the next step is to mix it all up, and for this first round, we're gonna totally mix it, and that's gonna create the base. And then we're gonna put a little bit more paint in and really lightly mix it so you'll get the marbling. This is really handy, the drill with the mixer on. If you don't have this, you can do it by hand, but this might be a good thing to invest in for this project. And you wanna make sure that you're bracing this so it doesn't fly all over the place. And then we're gonna mix. Whoa! Ah! It can look a little intimidating, but honestly, it's not that difficult. It's like mixing a cake. You just gotta put a little bit more oomph into it. So now we have the base coat. I'm gonna leave this in here and I'm gonna add a little bit more paint. And there's really no exact science to this, but once I put that paint in, I'm just gonna do a really light mix on this, and that way you'll get more of that marbling effect when you put this on the wall. You wanna go a lot slower for this round. And make sure you get all the way down to the bottom. And you can see a lot of this is lighter and darker, and as you start spreading it on the wall, you'll see that, and it'll create a really cool plaster-like effect. I'm gonna scoop a bunch of this goodness right into my mud pan. Look at that pretty marbling. And now we're ready to take it to the wall. But first, I'm gonna show you the technique. And for this, have fun. Instead of going up and down like you would when you're skim coating, we're gonna create more arcs throughout the wall and get a lot of that movement going. You're gonna see a lot of ridges, and that's fine. We'll knock that down later on with a squeegee. But I like to do crisscross patterns, move back and forth, whatever just will create a lot of movement and makes it look like a real plaster wall. Start with swooping. And you can kind of see there's a little bit of texture on this wall, and it's starting to cover that up. You'll really get it all covered up with that second coat. So if you had a lot thicker texture, you might have to do multiple coats, but we should be able to cover up this entire wall with 2 coats. So you can start with a smaller area, maybe like 4 by 4 feet, and then before it gets too dry, you're gonna wanna go over and knock down some of those big ridges with a squeegee. And this also creates some texture, the good kind of texture. You can see a little bit of the marbling right here. You always wanna remember that the base coat is gonna dry lighter, but if it's not as dramatic as marbling as you want, we can always adjust that on the second coat and add a little bit more paint, stir it less, so there'll be more variation. And you're definitely gonna wanna do this with your hair down because that way you'll have a bunch of mud in it. So winning right there. It's one of those just projects that you can have fun with. You can get really messy. And we taped off the baseboard, that way you can go right up to the edge. And then you can knock it down again with your squeegee. I wouldn't press too hard. I kind of like all this texture right here in that movement. And then for the inside corner, you can just go right up to it and pull out. We're actually gonna be doing this wall too, but if you weren't, you'd wanna tape this wall off. When I get to the corner, sometimes I like just to adjust my hand placement to make it more comfortable. And then I pull out from the corner and then switch back this way to do the X's. And if you have an outside corner, you can just spread it on and then smooth it out. And if you have a little bit of buildup, don't worry, we can always go back later and knock it down with some sandpaper. So we're done with our first coat and we're gonna let it dry overnight. And you can kind of see over there how it's starting to dry and it gets a lot lighter. So the whole wall will be a lot lighter tomorrow. I'm gonna clean up and we'll be back tomorrow. We're back on day 2 and I think I pretty much nailed it on the first coat. The color is exactly what I was looking for, kind of like this cement look, plaster look, and the color variation is actually really good. So I don't think we're gonna have to do too much with the second coat. There's definitely some areas, some of these white areas that I wanna go back and cover up. We actually have the plaster from yesterday, so I wanna add a little bit more water in it to thin it out, and then I'm gonna add a little bit more paint and just use a wood stir stick and stir it up just to get a little bit more marbling, and then we'll go back and touch it up. But before I do that, there are some larger ridge areas right here and a little bit of buildup in the corner. So I'm gonna sand that down and then we'll tape off this edge so we can get a really clean, crisp line on the second coat. And I'm just using a 150 grit sandpaper and lightly going over all the ridges. You don't want to go too hard and take off the plaster treatment. And then this is that outside corner. If you have any buildup, you can just run your block up and down and create a nice sharp corner. The sanding's looking really good. Now I'm just gonna tape off this inside corner so I can get a really crisp line. We actually have some of the mixture left over from yesterday, which is nice because it'll be the exact same color as the base, but I do want to add a little bit of water to it to thin it out. Make sure that you cover it overnight. So we're gonna add a little more water. Probably just a 1/4 cup for a 1/4 pail. And then I wanna add a little bit more color, but not too much, because I really like the color of this base, but I wanna add a little bit more color and swirl it around so there'll be a little bit more marbling. Oh, gotta get both arms into it. I have the second coat all mixed up, and we're gonna do the same technique as we did before, except I don't think we need as much coverage because we really got most of the wall covered yesterday. So we're gonna just go over these areas. Today I got my hair back, so there'll be no mud in it. And we're just gonna do that same motion as we did yesterday, crisscrossing. If you can really smooth it out, that'll save you some work. The key to a project like this is doing it really irregular, not really doing straight lines. You want it to look organic. So the more variation that you do, the better. We're working on a fairly smooth wall, so 2 coats should cover it. Actually, 1.5 coats that will cover it, but if you have a wall with a lot of thick texture on, you might need to do 2 or 3 coats. And you might have to put it on a little bit thicker, which means a little longer dry time. I'm done with the second coat, and now I'm just gonna let this dry overnight, and we'll come back and do a final sanding, and then we'll be done with this project. Today is the 3rd and final day for the plaster wall. It was totally worth it. It turned out better than I could have even imagined. I love how much character it gives to this once blank wall. There's a couple of ridges I want to sand down, but I don't want to mess with it too much because I really like how it looks. But first I'm going to pull the tape. I'm just knocking down some of these ridges. I like to do irregular movements. It adds to the character. The faux plaster wall is done. I brought in a bunch of items, and I just love that this is an inexpensive way to add some character and texture to a wall. In this chapter, I showed you how to create a faux plaster wall using mud and paint. I can't wait to see where you put a plaster wall in your house.